Gavin Newsom walked into the Bakersfield town hall believing he had the cleanest possible political setup in front of him. A live television audience, millions of viewers watching from home, a carefully rehearsed attack on Donald Trump, and a chance to present himself as the polished Democratic alternative for the next presidential cycle. He opened aggressively, calling Trump a convicted felon, a failed president, and a threat to democracy, language clearly designed to frame the entire encounter before Trump could establish his own terms. Newsom delivered it with the confidence of a politician who has spent years mastering television, leaning into the microphone, tightening the attack, and presenting every accusation as though the verdict had already been written. The crowd supporting him erupted exactly where his team would have expected, and for a few seconds, Newsom looked like a man who believed the evening was moving perfectly according to plan. Then Trump reached for the leather folder sitting on his lap, and the argument shifted from slogans about Trump's legal history to documents about Gavin Newsom's record. Trump did not try to out-polish Newsom, because competing with Gavin Newsom on Polish would have been like entering a hair commercial against the spokesman already holding the bottle. Instead, he opened the folder and went directly after the image Newsom had spent years constructing around himself, beginning with the story of the supposedly self-made California politician who understood ordinary people because he had worked ordinary jobs. Trump brought up William Newsom III, Gavin Newsom's father, and his longtime relationship with Gordon Getty, one of the heirs to one of the most famous oil fortunes in American history. He emphasized the obvious contradiction between presenting yourself as a man who climbed from modest circumstances and growing up with direct access to a billionaire family powerful enough to open doors most Americans would never even see. Newsom could call it access, privilege, family friendship, or whatever smoother phrase sounded better in a memoir, but Trump's point was brutally simple. Most people who call themselves self-made did not begin adulthood with Gordon Getty standing behind them. Trump then moved to Plump Jack, the wine business Newsom launched after college, and highlighted the financial support that came from the Getty family during those early years. The argument was not that Newsom had committed some offense by accepting wealthy backing, because Trump himself had never pretended that wealthy family connections did not exist in business. The attack was aimed at the branding, the carefully packaged biography, the version of Newsom presented to voters as though he had built everything from scratch, without the kind of financial network that can turn a risky business idea into a protected opportunity. Trump openly mocked that contradiction, reducing Newsom's polished origin story to something far less heroic and far more familiar in elite political circles. Powerful family connections, wealthy patrons, financial protection, and a public narrative cleaned up afterward. That was why the phrase Getty Boy landed so effectively inside the structure of Trump's attack, because it compressed an entire argument about privilege into 2 words without needing another speech. Newsom tried to answer by saying he had always been transparent about his background and that his mother had struggled financially, but the response did little to change the central point Trump was making. Trump was not arguing that every moment of Newsom's childhood had been luxurious, nor was he claiming that having influential family friends automatically erased all personal effort. He was arguing that political biographies should be judged by the same standard politicians demand from everyone else, and that access to a billionaire oil family is not a minor footnote when that family later helps finance your first major business venture. The sharper Trump pushed that contrast, the more Newsom's carefully maintained image became part of the evidence rather than protection from it. The man who arrived hoping to make Trump defend his character was suddenly being forced to explain the construction of his own. Trump closed the Getty section with the accusation that Newsom was less a grassroots public servant than a political product supported by wealthy interests, and then redirected the exchange toward governing decisions. The transition mattered because the Getty material was not being presented as an isolated personal insult, but as the opening frame for everything that followed. Trump's message was that if voters misunderstood where Gavin Newsom came from, they might also misunderstand the style of leadership that developed once he held power. That brought the discussion to November 2020. COVID restrictions, closed businesses, limited gatherings, shuttered classrooms, struggling families, and one photograph that had become almost impossible to separate from Newsom's governorship. The second folder was marked French Laundry. Trump reminded the audience that California residents had been subjected to some of the strictest pandemic restrictions in the country, while Newsom was publicly instructing people to avoid gatherings outside their households. Restaurants were fighting for survival. Employees were losing hours or jobs. Parents were trying to manage work while their children attended classes through computer screens, and families were being told that even ordinary social contact could carry consequences. Against that backdrop came the dinner at the French Laundry, one of the most expensive and famous restaurants in California, where Newsom attended a gathering with multiple people at a time when his administration was telling everyone else to limit exactly that kind of behavior. Trump held up the photograph and focused on the visual contradiction because no complicated policy explanation was needed once viewers could see the image for themselves. The governor, who had spent months telling Californians what they could not do, had been photographed doing something ordinary Californians were being told not to do. The location made the optics even worse because the French Laundry was not some neighborhood diner where Newsom had accidentally wandered into an overcrowded table. It was a luxury restaurant associated with wealth, exclusivity, expensive food, expensive wine, and precisely the sort of elite social circle that already fit Trump's broader argument about Newsom's political identity. Trump emphasized the price of the meal, the size of the gathering, the absence of visible distancing, and the presence of figures connected to California's medical establishment. The point was not merely that Newsom had attended dinner, because a dinner by itself would have been politically forgettable. The point was that he had demanded sacrifice from millions of people and then appeared willing to make exceptions for himself. Newsom had already admitted publicly that attending the dinner was a mistake, and during the exchange, he again attempted to contain the damage by framing it as a bad decision that he had acknowledged. Trump refused to let the apology close the subject because, within the logic of his argument, calling it a mistake minimized what ordinary Californians had actually experienced. A mistake is an incorrect appointment on a calendar, a forgotten grocery item, or a wrong turn on the highway. Governing restrictions that close businesses while the governor sits at an elite restaurant with political insiders carries a much heavier political meaning. Trump framed it as contempt, not confusion, because the rules had not been mysterious and Newsom had not been unaware of them. He was the governor enforcing them. Trump then widened the French Laundry attack by bringing California's school closures into the same frame, focusing specifically on the contrast between families struggling through remote education and Newsom's own children having access to private schooling. Millions of California parents had watched young children attempt to learn through laptops, fight through unstable schedules, lose classroom interaction, and fall behind academically while government officials insisted the restrictions were necessary. Trump's argument was that whatever defense Newsom offered publicly, his own family had options that many of the families living under his policies did not have. That distinction turned the issue from hypocrisy into something more politically damaging because it suggested two separate Californias operating under the same governor. One California followed the rules because it had no alternative, while the other had money, access, private institutions, and enough influence to move around the consequences. Trump kept pressing because French Laundry was not useful to him simply as an old scandal, but as a symbol that reinforced the earlier Getty argument. The billionaire connections showed privilege at the beginning of Newsom's career, and the restaurant controversy showed how privilege looked once Newsom controlled the largest state government in the country. Newsom could still point to economic statistics, job creation, innovation, and California's enormous GDP. But those numbers could not erase the image of small businesses closing while their governor attended an expensive dinner. They could not erase parents managing remote classrooms while powerful families had better choices available to them. And by the time Trump reached for the next folder, the evening had already stopped being a launch pad for Newsom's national ambitions and had become an audit of the record he had hoped nobody would examine line by line. The third folder was heavier than the others, and Trump made sure the audience understood why before he even began reading from it, because this section was no longer about personal branding, expensive dinners, or hypocrisy during lockdowns, but about taxpayer money measured in numbers so large that most people rarely encounter them outside federal budgets. He turned to California's Employment Development Department, the agency responsible for unemployment benefits during the pandemic, and laid out the central allegation that at least $20 billion had been paid out in fraudulent claims while Newsom was governor. Trump emphasized the scale repeatedly because $20 billion is not a rounding error, not a clerical mistake, and not the kind of loss that can be brushed aside with bureaucratic language about unprecedented circumstances. Millions of legitimate workers were depending on the system during a historic crisis, yet, according to the audit material Trump cited, fraudsters, prisoners, and organized groups were able to exploit weaknesses that California failed to stop in time. The contrast was vicious. Ordinary people waited for help, while criminals discovered that one of the richest states in America had built an unemployment system with doors that looked locked from the outside, but apparently swung open once somebody knew where to push. Trump focused on one detail because it captured the absurdity of the entire failure more effectively than any long policy explanation could have done: the claim that only 2 people had been assigned to manually review fraud in a state approaching 40 million residents during the largest unemployment surge in modern memory. 2 people checking a flood of claims while billions of federal dollars were moving through the system was the kind of management structure that would sound unbelievable if it had appeared in a satire rather than an auditor's report. He pointed to claims associated with incarcerated people and argued that basic cross-checking between prison records and unemployment applications should have been one of the most obvious safeguards imaginable. He then attacked the decision to reduce or disable fraud controls in order to accelerate payments, presenting it not as compassionate emergency management, but as administrative recklessness with a taxpayer-funded vault. Newsom tried to broaden the blame by noting that unemployment fraud occurred across the country, but Trump immediately dragged the discussion back to California and refused to let a national problem become an excuse for California's specific losses. The response was simple and intentionally unforgiving. Other states faced fraud too, but California's losses were so extraordinary that invoking everyone else only made the state's performance look worse rather than better. Trump framed the EDD disaster as a test of executive competence, arguing that emergency conditions do not reduce the responsibility of a governor, but increase it because the consequences of weak systems become larger when more money is moving faster. He did not allow the issue to dissolve into technical explanations about federal programs, application backlogs, staffing shortages, or pandemic chaos, because his political point depended on ownership. Newsom had spent years taking credit for California's scale, California's economy, California's innovation, and California's leadership, so Trump argued that he could not suddenly become a passive observer when the same enormous state machinery produced one of the most expensive fraud failures in the country. If the governor wants the applause when the machine works, Trump's message was that the governor also gets the invoice when the machine breaks. Then he moved from unemployment fraud to homelessness, another issue where California had spent enormous sums while the visible crisis continued to grow across cities, sidewalks, freeway underpasses, and downtown business districts. Trump cited the California State Auditor's findings on roughly $24 billion spent across homelessness programs over several years, and attacked the state for failing to maintain enough consistent data to determine which programs were actually producing measurable results. That was the line he wanted viewers to remember, because spending billions is politically easy when politicians can hold press conferences, announce programs, and promise transformational outcomes. But accountability begins later when somebody asks what the money bought. Trump argued that California had spent staggering sums while homelessness remained severe, and that the absence of clear statewide tracking made the failure worse because officials could not even provide voters with a clean, comprehensive answer about effectiveness. To him, this was not compassionate government functioning imperfectly, but a management culture where enormous checks were written first and the demand for receipts came years afterward. He attacked the state's resistance to tougher auditing and tracking requirements with even more force, because the political optics were almost impossible to defend once the discussion shifted from spending priorities to transparency. Trump's question was brutally direct. If the programs work, why resist the systems that would prove they work? And if they do not work, why keep spending without knowing where the failures are occurring? He highlighted Newsom's veto of legislation requiring additional homelessness spending accountability and used that action as evidence for his larger claim that transparency became inconvenient whenever it threatened to expose poor results. Whether Newsom considered the legislation redundant, flawed, or unnecessary was beside the point in Trump's presentation, because the visual was devastating enough. Billions spent, auditors criticizing data quality, and the governor rejecting another attempt to force clearer tracking. Trump then combined the figures from unemployment fraud and homelessness spending into the number he wanted hanging over the entire debate: $44 billion tied to two enormous failures of oversight and accountability. He wrote the total down because the number itself did more political damage than another 5 minutes of argument could have accomplished, and then he held it up as if he were presenting an invoice directly to California taxpayers. $44 billion was not being framed as a technical dispute over accounting categories, but as the cost of a governing philosophy that Trump said rewarded scale, bureaucracy, and headlines without demanding enough proof that programs were working. Newsom could cite California's economy, its technology sector, its climate goals, and its national influence, but Trump kept forcing the argument back to execution, because leadership means very little if the systems underneath it hemorrhage money while the governor continues delivering polished speeches. The attack was designed to strip away ideological debate entirely and reduce the question to management. Money went in, failures came out, and the person asking for a promotion to the presidency was the executive who had been standing at the top. That is why Trump's accusation that America could not afford Newsom was sharper than a normal partisan insult, because he tied it directly to dollar amounts already sitting on the table. From there, Trump opened the folder marked donors and shifted to the fast food minimum wage law, presenting it as another example of the gap between Newsom's public messaging and the political relationships surrounding him. Newsom had promoted the $20 minimum wage for covered fast food workers as a victory for working Californians, the kind of policy perfectly suited to his image as a progressive governor standing against large corporations. Trump then pointed to the controversy involving an exemption connected to restaurants that produce bread and focused attention on billionaire businessman Greg Flynn, a major franchise operator who had also been a significant Newsom donor. He stressed Flynn's ownership ties to Panera locations, his past relationship with Newsom, and the campaign contributions, arguing that the combination created exactly the appearance of insider treatment that ordinary voters already suspect when legislation contains oddly specific language. Trump's attack did not need a complicated corruption theory to be politically damaging, because the simple sequence was enough for television: donor, relationship, exemption, benefit. Newsom's allies could dispute the interpretation, point to later statements about how the law applied or insist that no special favor had ultimately been delivered. But Trump was not constructing a law school seminar, he was constructing a record of patterns. Wealthy connections had appeared in Newsom's business origins, elite access had appeared during the pandemic, billions had disappeared into fraud and poorly tracked programs, and now a wealthy donor appeared next to a controversial legislative carve-out. Trump's purpose was to make every separate controversy reinforce the previous one until viewers stopped seeing isolated incidents and started seeing a governing culture. That is always the more dangerous political attack because a candidate can explain one scandal, apologize for one dinner, blame one agency, or dispute one article, but explaining a pattern requires dismantling the entire frame at once. By this point, Newsom was no longer debating one accusation at a time. He was fighting the accumulation. Trump then reached deeper into the donor folder and turned to Dana Williamson, Newsom's former chief of staff, whose federal criminal case provided another opportunity to attack the governor's judgment. He highlighted the charges involving fraud, tax offenses, conspiracy, and financial misconduct, then emphasized that Williamson had occupied one of the most powerful positions inside the governor's operation. Trump's argument was not that every crime committed by an employee automatically becomes the personal crime of the executive who hired that employee, because that would be too easy to challenge. Instead, he attacked Newsom's management instincts, arguing that a chief of staff is not some distant bureaucrat buried 5 levels down in an agency, but the person responsible for coordinating the governor's office, controlling access, managing priorities, and operating close to the center of power. That made Williamson useful to Trump not simply as another scandal, but as another test of Newsom's ability to identify problems inside his own organization. When Newsom responded that Williamson's conduct was her own and that he had no knowledge of it, Trump immediately turned the defense into the next accusation. If Newsom knew what was happening, the implication was terrible, but if he did not know, Trump argued that the ignorance itself raised questions about competence and oversight. It was a deliberately narrow trap because either answer kept the focus exactly where Trump wanted it, on the governor's judgment rather than on Williamson's individual guilt. The stack on Trump's notepad was getting longer: billionaire connections, French laundry, EDD fraud, homelessness spending, donor controversy, and now a former chief of staff caught in a federal criminal case. And with the financial and administrative sections now laid out, Trump prepared to move into the most personal part of the confrontation, where the debate would stop being about how Gavin Newsom governed California and turn directly towards the character of the man asking America to trust him with even more power. Trump let the financial accusations settle for a moment before opening the next folder, because the debate was about to move away from agency failures, donor relationships, and state spending, and into the question Newsom himself had raised at the beginning of the night: character. Newsom had entered Bakersfield attacking Trump as a convicted felon, a failed president, and a threat to democracy. So Trump turned the standard around and argued that if personal conduct was fair ground for judgment, then the governor's own history could not suddenly become off limits. He reached back to 2007, when Newsom was mayor of San Francisco and his political career was still climbing rapidly, and brought up Alex Turk, the close political advisor who had helped manage Newsom's campaigns and career. Trump then identified Ruby Rippey Turk, Alex Turk's wife, and a subordinate who worked inside Newsom's office, and laid out the affair that had already become public years earlier. The point was not that the scandal was new, because it was not, but that Newsom had chosen to build his attack around moral authority while carrying a personal record Trump believed deserved the same scrutiny. Trump emphasized the betrayal at the center of the episode because that was the part that made the story politically corrosive even nearly 2 decades later. Alex Turk had been one of Newsom's closest allies, a man tied directly to his political rise, and the affair involved both Turk's wife and a woman who worked within the structure of Newsom's office. Newsom had publicly admitted the affair after it became known and had apologized, but Trump refused to treat the apology as a permanent shield against further questions about judgment. He framed the episode as evidence of what a person does when loyalty, power, friendship, and private temptation collide outside the controlled environment of a television studio. In Trump's presentation, character was not the speech delivered afterward, but the decision made before the cameras arrived. Then he sharpened the attack by turning to the later dispute over how the affair had been described in Newsom's memoir, and how Ruby Rippy Turk had described the sequence of events herself. Trump focused on the claim that Newsom had presented himself as having come clean, while Rippy Turk later said that she had been the one who confessed the affair to her husband. That discrepancy gave Trump exactly what he wanted, not merely an old scandal, but a newer argument about narrative control, memory, and political image management. He accused Newsom of rewriting the story in a way that made his own role appear more honorable than the woman involved said it had been. For a politician whose public strength depended heavily on message discipline, image, and presentation, the accusation that he was still polishing the story years later cut directly into the same brand Trump had been attacking from the first folder. Newsom tried to push the matter back into the past, emphasizing that the affair had happened roughly 20 years earlier and had already been addressed. Trump rejected that defense by arguing that the relevant issue was not simply the age of the conduct, but the more recent way Newsom had chosen to describe it. That allowed Trump to keep the argument in the present, because the memoir was not a document from 2007, but part of Newsom's continuing public presentation of himself. He then summarized the character case in the harshest possible terms, portraying the affair as betrayal, abuse of trust, and another example of Newsom shaping the story after the fact to protect the political image. By the time Trump closed that folder, Newsom's original attack on Trump's character had been turned into a full examination of his own. Trump then picked up the final folder, and the tone of the exchange shifted again because this section dealt not with private conduct or political optics, but with the destruction caused by the January 2025 wildfires in Los Angeles. He referenced the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire, the neighborhoods destroyed, the homes reduced to ash, and the scale of damage suffered by families who had spent decades building lives that disappeared in hours. Trump held up images of burned communities and used the visual devastation to force the policy discussion away from abstract climate rhetoric and toward preparation, infrastructure, prevention, and emergency readiness. He argued that 6 months before the fires, Newsom had signed a state budget containing reductions to several wildfire prevention and forest resilience programs. The attack was structured to make one question unavoidable. If wildfire risk is among California's most predictable emergencies, why were prevention programs being cut before one of the most destructive fire events in recent memory? Trump cited reductions involving fuel management, conservancy work, home protection efforts, monitoring, and research, treating each cut not as an isolated budget choice, but as part of a larger failure to prioritize the threat California already knew it faced. He then brought up the Santa Ynez Reservoir, a major source of firefighting water that was offline during the Palisades emergency because of maintenance issues, and used that fact to argue that California had failed at the most basic level of readiness. A reservoir built to support firefighting does not become less important because climate policy receives more attention. In Trump's argument was that government has to handle both long-term environmental goals and immediate operational responsibilities at the same time. He contrasted the unavailable water infrastructure with large state allocations for climate initiatives, zero-emission programs, and other environmental spending, portraying the difference as a government obsessed with fashionable policy language while neglecting practical systems that people depend on during an actual disaster. The accusation was deliberately unsparing. California had spent enormous sums talking about future climate risk while failing to make sure critical firefighting infrastructure was ready when the present risk arrived. Trump attacked that contradiction because it fit almost perfectly into every theme he had developed earlier in the evening. With unemployment fraud, he had argued that California moved money without sufficient controls. With homelessness, he had argued that California spent enormous amounts without sufficient tracking. With French laundry, he had argued that the people enforcing the rules were insulated from their consequences. And with the fires, he argued that the state again prioritized political presentation over basic execution. Newsom could respond that wildfires are driven by complex forces, extreme weather, drought, wind, climate conditions, local agencies, and infrastructure decisions spread across multiple levels of government. But Trump's case was built around the responsibilities attached to executive leadership. A governor who takes credit for California's climate leadership cannot, in Trump's framing, step away from accountability when the systems intended to reduce wildfire danger or support emergency response fail under pressure. Trump then widened the argument from fire preparation to the broader report card Californians themselves were delivering through migration and business relocation. He pointed to companies and residents leaving the state for places such as Texas, Florida, and Tennessee, presenting that movement as a market judgment more revealing than any campaign speech. People do not need to agree with a political party in order to compare taxes, housing costs, regulation, public safety, business conditions, and quality of life. And Trump used the departures as evidence that Newsom's California model was pushing too many people toward the exits. He mocked Newsom's habit of citing California's enormous economy as proof of success, arguing that inherited scale and natural advantages should not be confused with competent management. In Trump's formulation, the real question was not whether California remained rich and powerful, because it obviously did, but whether the state was becoming easier or harder for ordinary people to afford, operate a business in, raise a family in, and remain in. Newsom made one more attempt to return to the statistics that had always served him best: job creation, innovation, climate leadership, economic power, and California's role as a national engine of technology and investment. Trump immediately countered by naming the categories where California also led or ranked near the top for the wrong reasons: homelessness, high living costs, population loss, and taxpayer money lost through failed oversight. The contrast left Newsom arguing from aggregate strength, while Trump argued from lived consequences. And in a room filled with farmers, workers, small business owners, and families, the latter was easier to translate into anger. Trump's central claim had become clear by then. California's size could hide management failures for years because the state was wealthy enough to survive mistakes that would bankrupt smaller governments. But if Newsom wanted to take that governing model nationwide, Trump argued, the country deserved to examine every invoice before granting him the promotion. Trump closed the final folder, stacked the documents in front of him, and returned to the opening insult that had started the confrontation. Newsom had come prepared to force Trump to defend his record, but Trump had spent the evening forcing Newsom to defend billionaires, lockdown hypocrisy, unemployment fraud, homelessness spending, donor relationships, staff misconduct, personal character, wildfire preparation, and the broader direction of California. The polished campaign language that had sounded commanding at the beginning now had to compete with paper records, dollar figures, photographs, audit findings, and controversies that were much harder to dismiss with a rehearsed line. Trump's argument was not that California had achieved nothing, but that Newsom had mastered the art of taking credit for the state's strengths while escaping responsibility for its most visible failures. And as Trump prepared to deliver his final judgment, the town hall that Newsom had entered as a potential national showcase had become something far more dangerous for him. A public accounting of the record he wanted voters to see only through the lens of his own presentation. Trump stacked the 6 folders into a clean pile, looked across the table at Gavin Newsom, and reduced the entire night to the distinction he wanted every viewer to remember. Newsom had arrived with accusations, while Trump had arrived with documents. He told Newsom that attacking him was predictable political theater, but attacking someone who had prepared an answer for every category of criticism was a different kind of mistake, because the conversation could no longer be controlled by one polished opening statement. Trump framed himself as a builder, someone accustomed to budgets, contracts, projects, numbers, and consequences, while portraying Newsom as a politician who built press conferences, slogans, and carefully managed images instead of systems ordinary Californians could trust. He mocked the governor's presentation one final time, even returning to the perfect hair that had become part of the evening's running contrast between surface and substance. Then he stood, gathered the folders under his arm, and told the audience that the California of farmers, small business owners, working families, and people who followed the rules deserved better than the record he had just placed on the table. Newsom remained seated while Trump walked away, and the visual was almost as damaging as anything that had been said during the exchange, because the governor, who had entered with the posture of a national contender, now looked trapped inside the evidence that had accumulated around him. The smile that had opened the town hall was gone. The easy rhythm of the television politician was gone, and the polished confidence that usually allowed Newsom to glide from one talking point to another had been replaced by the stillness of someone who understood that every answer now carried another question behind it. He had come to Bakersfield intending to make Trump's record the subject of the night and potentially leave with footage that could support a future presidential campaign. Instead, the event ended with Newsom's own record organized into folders, numbers, photographs, scandals, audits, spending failures, donor controversies, and personal contradictions. What was supposed to look like the beginning of a national campaign now looked like a public dissection of the argument for that campaign. The clip spread immediately, and the first images that dominated social media were not Newsom's prepared attacks, but Trump's handwritten summaries and the repeated references to the money. Governor Hair Gel began circulating as a mocking label, while screenshots of the notes listing Getty Boy, French Laundry, the $44 billion figure, the Panera controversy, the chief of staff scandal, and the broader accusation of failure moved across conservative accounts at extraordinary speed. The $20 billion unemployment fraud segment became especially powerful because the number was simple enough to understand instantly and large enough to provoke outrage before anyone even reached the details. Conservative media replayed the exchange repeatedly, but what made the damage more serious for Newsom was that the conversation did not remain isolated inside conservative outlets. Once mainstream commentators began discussing the documents themselves instead of dismissing the event as another Trump performance, Newsom lost the easiest possible defense. CNN's post-event analysis focused on Trump's use of public records and auditor material, noting that much of the attack was built not around anonymous accusations, but around government reports, financial disclosures, and Newsom's own public history. When Democratic defenders tried to describe the confrontation as bullying, the response from analysts was uncomfortable but straightforward. Reading from state audit findings is not made false simply because the politician reading them does it aggressively. MSNBC attempted to provide more context around the spending figures and the homelessness audit, but even its coverage had to confront the political damage created by the combination of enormous expenditures, inadequate tracking, and Newsom's veto of additional transparency legislation. Fox News predictably turned the strongest exchanges into a recurring highlight reel, But California newspapers mattered more because they could not easily be dismissed as outsiders attacking the state. Once Newsom's hometown press began comparing his public narrative with the findings contained in state records, the story moved from partisan entertainment into a crisis of credibility. The Sacramento Bee editorial board demanded clearer answers about the billions associated with unemployment fraud and homelessness spending, while the San Francisco Chronicle revisited both the financial record and the personal history that Trump had dragged back into public view. The most damaging conclusion was not that every Trump characterization had to be accepted exactly as delivered, but that enough of the underlying material was grounded in public records to prevent Newsom from simply waving the entire event away as fiction. That distinction mattered because Newsom's strongest political weapon had always been presentation. Speak confidently, move quickly, cite California's scale, and make opponents appear smaller than the state he governed. Trump had attacked the presentation itself by placing primary documents beside it. Once viewers began asking which parts of Newsom's response directly answered those records rather than merely changing the subject, the governor's familiar television style became far less effective. The polling described after the event reflected that collapse in confidence, with Newsom's favorability dropping sharply in California and suffering even larger declines among independents and younger voters. For a politician widely discussed as a possible future Democratic presidential candidate, weakness among precisely the voters required to expand beyond a partisan base was more threatening than criticism from Republicans could ever be. Prediction markets moved him downward among potential 2028 contenders, and donor interest that had been quietly developing around a national campaign began to cool. Major political bundlers reportedly redirected their attention toward other Democratic possibilities, including Gretchen Whitmer, while donors who had viewed Newsom as the party's polished executive alternative began confronting the management question Trump had forced onto national television. A candidate can survive ideological attacks from the other party, but it becomes much harder to survive when donors begin wondering whether the central selling point of competence has been broken. The Democratic response was careful enough to reveal the problem without anyone needing to announce an open revolt. Nancy Pelosi said governors should be prepared to account for public spending, a statement that sounded neutral on paper, but offered Newsom none of the sweeping defense he might have wanted from one of California's most powerful Democratic figures. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez publicly supported Newsom, but did not directly engage the major financial allegations, leaving the most damaging numbers untouched. Bernie Sanders went further by saying that if the figures were accurate, failures of that magnitude demanded investigation, and the conditional wording could not hide the political weight of the word investigation. Newsom was discovering one of the oldest rules in politics. Allies are loud when the attack is easy to dismiss and suddenly precise with their language when the documents become difficult to explain. The pressure then moved beyond television commentary as oversight bodies and investigators began examining issues already surrounding the California administration. The House Oversight Committee, which had been looking at California's use of pandemic funds, sought additional EDD communications tied to the period when fraud controls became a central controversy. Federal scrutiny surrounding Dana Williamson created another damaging cloud over Newsom's operation, while questions about donor relationships and the Panera exemption attracted additional attention inside California. Even if those reviews produced no allegation directly against Newsom, the political effect was immediate because every new request for records reinforced Trump's argument that the governor's administration deserved deeper examination. Newsom had entered the town hall demanding accountability from Trump and left facing a widening public demand for accountability of his own. 3 days later, Newsom released a professionally produced response from the governor's office, calling the event a reality television ambush and returning to the themes that had carried him through years of national interviews: California's economic strength, innovation, climate leadership, and the argument that unemployment fraud had been a nationwide pandemic problem. He acknowledged the need for better homelessness tracking and presented his administration as already moving toward greater accountability, but the problem was that the frame had changed before the video ever appeared. Every reference to leadership now competed with images of French Laundry. Every promise of transparency competed with the vetoed accountability measure, and every defense of state management competed with the $20 billion and $24 billion numbers Trump had placed beside each other. The response was polished, disciplined, and professionally produced, exactly the kind of communication Newsom had mastered throughout his career. It was also trying to repair a narrative after tens of millions of viewers had already been given a simpler one. Back in Bakersfield, the consequences were represented not by campaign strategists or television analysts, but by Tran Minh, the Vietnamese restaurant owner described near the end of the original account. During the pandemic shutdowns, he had watched the dining room of his 20-table restaurant remain closed for months while savings disappeared, assistance ran out, and the financial structure supporting his business collapsed. He eventually reopened on a smaller scale, 6 tables instead of 20, still carrying debt from the first restaurant and still living with the cost of policies that politicians could later summarize in a sentence. Watching Trump hold up the French Laundry photograph did not teach him anything new about the contradiction, because he had already experienced that contradiction through lost equipment, lost money, a lost lease, and years of rebuilding. When he finally turned off the clip and returned to the kitchen because customers were waiting, that ordinary responsibility said more about the difference between rules and consequences than another hour of political commentary could have added. That was the final frame the script returned to. Not the hair, not the slogans, not even the spectacle of 2 national political figures trading attacks under television lights, but the people who actually absorb the cost when government fails. The unemployment system can lose billions, and bureaucrats continue receiving salaries. Homelessness programs can spend billions without adequate measurement, and politicians still hold press conferences. Wealthy officials can violate the spirit of restrictions and later call it a mistake, but small business owners do not get to explain away a missed payroll or an empty dining room. Trump's entire takedown worked because he connected every accusation back to that basic asymmetry between those who make the rules and those who live under them. Newsom came to Bakersfield prepared to put Trump on trial, and instead spent the night watching his own record entered into evidence. The closing message was therefore as aggressive as the rest of the script. Share the clips, examine the documents, ask where the money went, ask why transparency had to be demanded after the spending instead of built into the spending from the beginning, and ask why political leaders should receive national promotions before answering for failures at home. The Getty connections, French Laundry, unemployment fraud, homelessness spending, donor controversies, Williamson case, character questions, wildfire preparation, and population movement were presented not as separate headlines, but as one accumulated indictment of Newsom's governing brand. Trump's case was that California's enormous wealth had allowed Newsom to hide poor execution behind impressive statistics for too long, while Newsom's case remained that the state's economic scale and progressive achievements proved the model worked. By the end of the confrontation, however, Trump had succeeded in forcing a different standard into the discussion. Not what California possesses, but what Gavin Newsom did with what California gave him. He came looking for a presidential launch reel, and according to the script's final judgment, he left Bakersfield carrying a record that no amount of polish, money, ambition, or perfect television hair could erase.